going, and before we get into the weeds, we want to honor and acknowledge that OCIC operates on Indigenous lands. Like myself, the OCIC team is joining virtually from Takaronto, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So if you were here yesterday, I asked you to reflect on your connection to the land. I asked you to think about the beautiful gifts from Earth that you're able to enjoy. I told you that for me, I'm lucky to live near a body of water. I live near the lake, but perhaps you can see, you know, the trees changing color by your window, or maybe you've taken a beautiful walk near a forest. Perhaps you grew vegetables in your garden this year. So if you had a chance to reflect yesterday, I'd love to hear what you're grateful for. Tell me about your connection to the land in the chat. One element, one thing that you're grateful for. I'd love to read it out loud. The autumn leaves falling, the rain, yes. Clean air to breathe, absolutely. Clean water, beautiful trails, the changing seasons, the Rideau River, and kayaking, that's lovely. Listening to my children's excitement at the colors of the leaves, yes, it can. The tiny little bit of sun today, yes. Thank you all, that's lovely, and truly resonates. I think that connection, not only from ourselves and the earth, but obviously you can see that between one another. So for me, as an immigrant and a guest on this land, I acknowledge and are eternally grateful for the ancestral, current, and future caretakers of this land, without whom I know I couldn't be here. Indigenous people from across Turtle Island and around the world have and continue to demand climate justice, sovereignty, and the right to live. And as a guest in this territory, I ask myself, how can I educate and stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples when called upon? How can I, as a youth, engage in reconciliation, decolonizing, and unlearning, starting inwards with myself? And we hope that this space today, but beyond the 2 days that we're going to be together, that we're able to honor the spirit of the dish with one spoon, and that we can amplify the teachings to share together and to center the well-being of Mother Earth, the water, and all of our relations. Thank you for being here with us today. And let's get this dialogue going. Before I pass it on to David, Kim, would you like to kick us off with some welcoming remarks?
Sure, thank you so much. That was beautiful. It's always beautiful to have Ohenia open these events, thoughtful and reflective. I want to thank all of you for being with us today and also for sharing your comments in the chat. Please continue to go ahead and do so. I think it brings us closer together to feel where we're each at. As many of you know, not all of you, but those who are joining us today, for the first time, this is the second day of our AGM and Symposium. It started yesterday with a very exciting round of governance procedures, very smooth voting processes, the election of new board members, some of which are here today. I can't see you all yet on my screen, but I'll write a note in there afterwards so we can announce who you are. Saying goodbye to some of the board members that have served us for quite a long time. And then an opening panel that focused on the COVID-19 pandemic and this collective agenda we have towards just recovery. The beginning of reflections from members on where we're at and where we need to go. And I hope an opening a space for us to think more creatively about how we might do that differently together in the next months going forward. Today, we're really grateful for your time and your participation in this 2 sessions. And we hope that the 9 contributors we've invited to share their insights, their lived experiences, their perspectives, their research, their ideas will support us. We really need to catalyze a big conversation in our sector and in society at large on systemic and internal organizational change and on ethical community engagement. I think we've all seen the last several months, there have been numerous calls for action, and our sector really must step to the table. And we need to do that as individual organizations, but we also need to do it together. We know that. I think today we anticipate that this might be uncomfortable for some people. We might feel challenged. We might feel stressed. We might also feel relieved that this conversation is happening and needs to be happening. And we expect more from each other and as a community of people who has a leadership role really within Canadian society and the world at large, that we are engaged at a local to global level. And this is our chance actually to come together in a profound way to make more and better change. Our desire today is to have that platform for open and respectful conversation and increased action, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people with disabilities, those that are the most vulnerable, those that have experienced and continue to experience systemic racism, discrimination, and exclusion. So we're excited to hear from our panelists and from all of you today. And so we are going to kick it off right away, turning to the panel, and I'll just invite Eugenia to go back and introduce David.
Thank you, Kim. What a great spirit to get us kicked off with. So David, and to all panelists, we're quite excited to have you here today with us. We asked all of you, and really the makeup of this panel is very intentional. We tapped into our network for folks that could help us think through in a critical way, but also in a very positive way, an action-oriented way, to think about systemic change, as Kim mentioned. So I'll pass it on to the panel, but before I do, I want to welcome David, our moderator. David is a friend of OCIC, has been for a number of years. He's a podcaster, interviewer. I think you talked about yourself as a conversationalist, and that's so, so true. Thank you for bringing your 20 years of experience to this conversation, and to the panelists that are here with us today, Sarah, Arizu, Gonzalo, and Ikem. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Eugenia, for inviting me today for the lovely introduction. And I just wanted to say I had the opportunity, amongst all the preparation and reading essays last night and going through the Istanbul principles once again, refreshing, my own thinking and so on. I had the opportunity to go for a walk with my daughter this morning. We a little bit of rain coming down, and we got out with Sasha, our rescue from Greece, actually, which is kind of interesting because some of you may know I've spent many years studying philosophy. So to have a Greek dog disciplined in the Socratic method is a really, really, really wonderful thing. So thanks for that beautiful introduction. And wow, what a pleasure to be here and to be alongside these panelists. And honestly, when I interview someone, I tell them I'm not a journalist. I'm not looking for the story, but I really am a conversationalist, as Eugenia said, and interested in peeling back those layers and going beyond scratching the surface. And I think that's what organizations like OCIC have been doing for years. So hey, I'm going to do a big collective thank you right now because I'm probably going to forget. But if you can send an emoji, give a thumbs up for the group, the people that you may not even know or seen or have met before that are making this happen. How about a collective digital round of applause for those folks? And there we go. Excellent. And I'm going to do the same. And yes, there we go. Beautiful. I love it. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, OCIC, for providing a space, a safe space to dig a little deeper. Each of the speakers is going to get, we have a couple rounds planned. Each speaker is going to get about 8 minutes to talk about themselves, the work they do, who they are, and what they're focusing on. And then we're going to go to a couple of rounds of questions and just interaction as a group. And then we're going to digitally break out and have some more opportunity to go a little deeper, a little more intentional, hopefully a little more intimate. And then we're going to come back, I believe, Eugenia, interrupt me here if I'm getting any of this wrong, but we're going to come back as a group and we're going to solve all of our problems here today. We have big challenges ahead. And if I could say, one of the things I've read recently that has been a real challenge to me is a piece by Naomi Klein in The Intercept. And if you haven't had a chance to see the video, you need to reach out, and maybe we'll find that, or I'll find it when someone's speaking. And she says, this time, you know, I'm just going to look for the quote here. It's the coronavirus has instantly exploded the cherished market manufactured myth of the individual as a self-made island. Close quote. Isn't that beautiful? It's a long piece. It's worth watching. There's a video that a few folks have come together to create, and she's written a piece alongside of it. So yes, dark times, difficult times, challenging times, but also we're in this together. And this is a beautiful thing to see your faces there visually. So thank you to each and every one of you. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before I hand it off to our first speaker, and just what I'm hopeful for here today, not only as a facilitator, but also as somebody who's worked in the development sector for years and continue to try to step into conversations in challenging and provocative ways, not just because, but with the goal towards a call to action. I've been spending a fair bit of time in the areas of public engagement, and it was wonderful to hear Global Affairs yesterday and how that's where they're heading collectively. That voice is saying, how do we actually engage Canadians? And I trust that as we end today on hope and resilience, part 4 of our conversation, we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of those things that we actually can do. How do we create systemic and transformative change? I mean, that's the question for me today. And that's a biggie. And I know that there's going to be a lot of questions that are going to be asked here that we can't answer, but that's kind of the point. And the point is that, you know, I hope most of us believe in that splash and ripple effect. I love the splash, but I'm so much more interested in the ripple. And it's that incremental change that I do believe in, that is going to make the difference. I believe seeds are going to be planted here today that are going to resonate for years to come. And that is a good and a beautiful and a true thing, and I think we need to celebrate that in many different ways. I woke up to a text. I do a lot of work in Cambodia. I'm still trying to do that digitally. It's obviously a challenge. I haven't been in country for quite some time now, but I woke up to 2 texts this morning from dear friends of mine who work in the travel sector, and how their worlds are kind of collapsing around them. And one of them was a tour guide, a museum guide, working for an international organization that's going to be closing its doors in Cambodia within the next couple of months. Another was a tour guide, a professional tour guide. His name's Salong. The other man's name is Soon. And then there's another man that I know who I've worked with for years. He's having a tough time finding any work. We are truly in this together, and this is without a doubt a global crisis. And so vulnerability. I woke up to a reminder from dear friends of mine, and isn't it wonderful that they were able to let me know? And now the question is, how do I respond? So I started that way because for me, it's all about story. Richard Wagamese, Indigenous writer, said that stories are meant to heal, and that's what I think we're going to be hearing about and stepping into here today. Things I'm going to be listening for. Conversations around transactional approaches. How do we critique that? How do we stay away from it? This data-driven sense of this is how we do development. We've got the binder, we have the folder. Hang on a minute here. There are people involved. And so instead of treating folks as means to an end, we need to treat people as ends in themselves, period. I'm going to be looking for comments and unique observations and insights around this notion of transformation. And all of it being rooted in a third thing, the sense of community, that we really, really are in all of this together. And so for me, the actions already, I'm thinking about how am I going to respond, and it's about listening, it's about asking questions, and it's about stepping into a deeper sense of dialogue. And all of this again. And I think, you know, Eugenia and Kim, and I'm sure our speakers will talk about it today, is all very much rooted in this notion of relationship. And remember, you know, I don't have to remind any of you this, but we are all extraordinary agents of change. And we all have this ability to step into these issues in a way that can make contact with reality. I had the pleasure and opportunity to interview Amir Amirani a couple of days ago. And another little shout out for his new film called We Are Many. It took him 9 years to make this film. wearemany.com, 9 years to make this film. People turned the other way. He couldn't get public funding. He had to privately fund it. And it is an astounding film about global resilience. Before social media, 2 million people marched on February 15th, 2003 in the streets of the UK to say no to the Iraq invasion. And 783 cities, I believe it was. Amir corrected me. I thought it was about 600 around the world stepped in, and the change that occurred. And ultimately, the film dives into all the questions. The only reason I tell you that is Amir stepped into this for 9 years, and check it out, watch the film, and you're going to be encouraged that change is coming. Today is a good day for change. And I think I just wanted to remind everyone of that in a sort of a narrative driven way, if that makes sense. Our first speaker, I've been told, is a lot of fun, and I was introduced to him just a couple of days ago, and I'm disappointed that we couldn't elbow bump or hug or shake hands and say hello properly in a face-to-face way, share a coffee together. But Ikem Opara is here with us today. I'm just going to read this out of his bio. I generally don't do that, but I love this phrase: designing and building opportunities that enable communities around the world to shape their own futures. I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, let's just talk about that for the next 90 minutes, really. Is there anything else we need, So thanks for that again. But I love that he is somebody who has spent most of his life listening and learning and educating others. He works with the Ontario Trillium Foundation in areas of capacity building and youth opportunities. I'm sure he's going to tell you a little bit more about that. And he was a former OCIC board member as well. So let's have a nice, warm digital welcome for Ikem Opara here. And thanks for joining us today, Kim.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. It's very good to see you again. It's good to see familiar names and faces on here because, like David said, yes, I used to be a board member of OCIC, and I think those were some of the most fun parts of my volunteering life. And I think that's what keeps drawing me back into these conversations and into these opportunities to share some time with you all. About myself, I think I'll start there. I like David said, I work now at the Ontario Trillium Foundation, where my focus is essentially within our Youth Opportunities Fund, supporting predominantly Black and Indigenous-led grassroots groups, supporting them to build the capacity to deliver on the projects that they're stewarding in the community, but also to think about what's next, to be able to raise their heads up from the work that they're doing right now, to think about, well, after this grant is over, after this project is over, after this engagement is over, what do we want to change, or what kind of opportunities do we want to see for our community? So that's where I spend most of my days. In the evenings, I'm figuring out how to stay funny and relevant for 2 3.5-year-old daughters who are like they're the light of our days here, and it's within that context that I see the world right now, as we are talking about what the future holds and what we can look to build to the future. The question that I keep coming back to is, how do I in some way contribute to leaving this as a better, more fertile, more interesting place for them to grow up, for them to sink their own anchors into making change and pushing our global dialogue forward in a productive way, and most importantly, in the ways that they see fit. I grew up in southeastern Nigeria in a university town, and I was accustomed to hearing my parents and their friends talking very passionately and emotionally about the project of nation building in a place like Nigeria, a post-colonial society, a country that went through a civil war in the 60s to define its own identity after the colonial experience, and a country that has continued to sort of struggle to figure out what its voice can be, that is shaped by Nigerians as opposed to shaped by the events that happen around us. Now, moving to Canada and now building my home and my life here in Scarborough, I think, like many people who are arbitraging both on multiple communities and multiple cultures, I spend a lot of my time in both spaces, in my heart and in my head. So it is natural that any conversations for me that have to do with the international development community or the community engagement community, I have to see them through multiple lenses. I have to see them through the lens of my experience growing up in Nigeria, my experience in Canada, my experience working in East Africa or in Cuba, in very different socioeconomic and cultural locations, right? So when we were putting together this panel, some of what I was asked to talk about, what I was asked to talk about is where the conversations we're having around inclusion fit into what world we build for the future. Much to David's disappointment, I'm actually going to completely discard that because David started with the, I see Bill's laughing, Bill knows me. Because David mentioned his Greek philosopher dog, it led me back to my political theory days where, like many nerds like myself, political theory was my most exciting part of my study of political science, which is what my undergraduate is in. And so I thought of two quotes. Today in society, we're having a lot of conversations about justice and what justice means and how it is accessible and not accessible for some and for others. So I'm going to throw out two quotes that I think, if you bear with me, I think lead back to what we're talking about today. One of them is Polemachus, who was one of the characters in the famous Republic narrative by Socrates, where Polemachus essentially describes justice as the art of doing good for your friends and evil to your enemies. So that is one definition of justice. And on the other hand, someone who might be more familiar to more of us in this conversation is Cornel West, talking about justice as what love looks like in public. Now, I think in our conversation, when we're talking about ethics of community engagement and how we engage with one another on both a local and an international scale, if we were to look at those two stances, and I'm not saying those are the definitive ones about what justice is, but I think we can start to pick up some threads of those two statements being very true for many people in society today. So I think the charge and where I like to spend my time is how can I make one more true than the other? How can I contribute through my understanding or the conversations that I push forward on how we think about engaging as a community, how we measure empirically and in terms of narrative, what it means to say that we have engaged with one another in a good way, in a healthy way, in an ethical way. If our ethics are the things that guide the way we behave and shape our values, how can we get to the point where our behaviors are more just to one another, individual to individual, at a policy level, at a design level? I'm spending a lot of time right now at OCAD University thinking about how processes and systems behave and how they're designed in an intentional way. So how do we infuse the notions of justice being a continuous expression of love in the public space in the ways that we intentionally design public infrastructure, social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, the ways that we design conversations like this that enable those who might typically not be able to be engaged in the conversation to be a part of it. So I will stop there in terms of what some of what my opening comments are to start this conversation. And in terms of a full introduction, like David said, my name is Ikem Opara. I'm Igbo. I was born and raised in southeastern Nigeria. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm sitting in my somewhat dark basement in Scarborough. Thank you.
Ikem, thanks for your thoughts and for, wow, coming in 22 seconds under time. That is remarkable. Well done, my friend. Thank you for that. That's awesome. I love how you say you want to stay funny and relevant, but it's within the context of your family and raising your children, and it's the lens that you're seeing the world through. And Cornell West, just brilliant line, and I'm so glad you brought it up. This what does love look like in public? And I hope we can get back to that in the breakouts, because really isn't that what it's really all about? If we really truly do believe in similarity through difference, doesn't it have to be rooted in that love for our families, our communities, and out beyond our grasp? And hey, listen, anyone who quotes Polemicus is okay with me. So thanks for that. That's a wonderful thing. Our next speaker is Sarah Hansen, and she's with Experiences Canada and the Youth Policymakers Hub at OCIC. I'm just not sure what Sarah does really in her spare time. She's pretty busy, but truthfully, actually, from what I understand, she's into ribbon skirt making and beading. And Sarah, I hope you can tell us a tiny bit more about that. That's awesome. Climate action and community engagement are things that are really important for her. I love this about Sarah, that she's taking a break from her second degree. Well, the nerve, Sarah, that's all I'm going to say. Taking a break from your second degree in human rights, social justice, and Indigenous studies at Carleton. How about a local and global digital welcome to our next guest, Sarah Hansen?
Thanks, David. Like David said, and I'm not even sure what was mentioned before about me, but I'm an Anishinaabe from Bigdaga Anishinaabe in northwestern Ontario. So if you think of Lake Superior, it's about just at the tip of it. If you look at the highest point, it's around there. However, I'm currently living and residing on the unceded and traditional lands of the Algonquin Nation, Anishinaabe, in what is currently known as Ottawa. And right now we're having like a torrential downpour, and I'm like looking out my balcony right now, and it's like literally pouring rain. And I love rain, so it's like kind of calming me, but I'm not an experienced speaker, so excuse me if I sound a little off. But like David said and mentioned, I wear many hats. By day, I do work at Experiences Canada as a project coordinator. Originally, I was hired to put together and coordinate this in-person youth reconciliation forum in Winnipeg. But because of COVID, like many people, we had to pivot, and we started these online conversation series, first around reconciliation, and that was back in May, and it was a really insightful conversation about the past, present, and future of the land we currently live on. And I'm going to be co-leading an upcoming anti-racism online conversation series starting at the end of this month. We're going to be going through 7 weeks of conversations around what that looks like, and it's a direct action from the summer's resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And I like to say resurgence because for many BIPOC individuals, racism hasn't left. It's been so relevant in our day-to-day lives, and even referring to as blanket anti-racism versus Black Lives Matter is important to me as an Indigenous person, because many of the instances that Black people go through, Indigenous people go through as well. By night, I do, other than beading and ribbon skirt making, I work another part-time job as a youth, or North American regional director at Youth for Nature. And I am working on engaging Indigenous people within this new space that they've created within the last year. And really just working to engage more people on the importance of nature as a action to combat climate change. And then, of course, I volunteer, and it sounds like I'm saying a lot about myself, but I volunteer because as an Indigenous person, I like to give back, and it's really important for me to include Indigenous perspectives in these spaces because a lot of people kind of revert to just having Indigenous spaces versus non-Indigenous, and I really like to look at change as combining these two and bringing them together and working together. So going through like what my list of things that I wanted to say, and I really wanted to talk about how I'm coming here today and sharing from a place that's both personal, but only one perspective of Indigenous inclusion within spaces, especially international cooperation or discussions of systemic change. Indigenous people aren't one, you can't just look at one person and think Indigenous. I'm First Nations, there's also Métis and Inuit who both have very different histories within Canada and different perspectives of what decolonization and reconciliation means, and to kind of put a blanket on any one person is a form of racism and systemic inequality. So I've grown up within these spaces that have negatively impacted Indigenous people so much, whether that be through residential schools, environmental racism, inadequate access to clean drinking water, or gender discrimination. And I've had to learn how to live within it, but also how to unlearn what I've been taught growing up. And it's really important for me to say that because I've had to learn how to benefit from the spaces I've lived in, and that is both going against what I've been taught as an Indigenous person, but also reconciling my non-Indigenous roots, because I have a Polish-Ukrainian immigrant grandfather who is very dear to my heart, and that is also part of my identity. And learning this is part of decolonization and unlearning that. And it's been easier for me, and I must recognize that because I am a youth Indigenous. I recognize the people who have come before me who have made it possible for me to even be living outside of our reservation, but also still being recognized by my band, because that is a fight that was long, hard, and fought to be able to do that. And for me, this process of understanding a space first is important. So the unlearning process is easier to understand. As I do find some policies and procedures in non-Indigenous spaces easier for me to understand because it has order and it has kind of specializations. But for many Indigenous people, this doesn't work. They have and what I love about Indigenous people is they have a very holistic way of thinking of things. So everything's interconnecting. And when we're talking about system and organizational change in the space, whether that be international cooperation or others, reconciliation is that other part, like I've mentioned. It's these two individuals and peoples coming together to create that just society for everyone. So when we're thinking of change in the future, it shouldn't just be all on Indigenous people to create. And for so long, it has been Indigenous people fighting against non-Indigenous. And what I really have loved doing, and why I kind of situate myself in places of non-Indigenous people, is to kind of include Indigenous people, but also to provide an Indigenous perspective, because I want to work together on creating that just society. Yeah, I think I also just want to mention that the international stage is easier for me as an Indigenous person to work in because of its global oriented thinking. One Indigenous aspect of people and their knowledge is that we don't see borders, and having this open understanding of space and land is really unique to Indigenous people, because we don't have to fight against these, like, we're thinking of Canada first or United States first or these other countries. We're all trying to work together because Indigenous peoples they moved constantly. So that's really something that I really like to think about when I'm working and living in these spaces, because it's so cool for me to do it. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah. And once again, I just got to say, you have 24 seconds left in your 8 minutes. This is, oh, Henya, what are you doing behind the scenes? This is genius. This is absolutely brilliant. So thank you for that. And it's great because I think we already so many, I think, stepping stones for further discussion. And I don't know if you know the filmmaker Loretta Sarah Todd, but she's made a film called Monkey Beach. Indigenous film. It's going to be coming out soon. It was at TIFF, and we talked I interviewed her recently. I had the privilege of interviewing her, and honestly, I loved how you talked about the importance of nature. And this is her film, and the establishing shots deep underwater, and just that natural order. Turtle Island was this and is now this, and you're enveloped by this. You're embraced by everything. And even as Ohenia mentioned right out of the gate, this idea of listening and looking a little closer. So thanks for that. The idea of that you don't put borders on things is just, again, why don't we just stop and talk about that, you know? And there's so many things to be reflecting on here. So thank you for that. And I think for me, I mean, just this notion of being holistic, how do we do that? You know, it's like you wake up in the morning and that should be, I don't know, do you have the word holism in like bold calibre font up, pasted to your ceiling? I don't know. But how do we remember? How do we continue to shock ourselves out of our complacency to think that way? And I think one of the ways we do it is we step into these kinds of conversations, and I trust and I hope that we continue to water the seeds that are being planted here today. Goal 16 and 17 of the SDGs are about peace and strong institutions and about partnerships. And I think that's, again, it's another beautiful thing. And thanks, Sarah, for sharing today. And looking forward to stepping into it in our first sort of round of Q&R together, question and response time, as it were. Our next speaker, Gonzalo Duarte, is here. He's with, he has a master in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership from Carleton. He is with Campaneros Incorporated, and he is into something that most of us probably are somewhat familiar with, international volunteering. He is also part of Global Exchange, and as a community, once again, I don't know what he does in his spare time, but a community manager at the Center for Social Innovation and Development, Growth, and Social Purpose. And Gonzalo, I'm looking forward to talking more with you about that, what this thing called social purpose is. And Ohenia, I just might toss it back to you because I think Gonzalo has some slides to share with the group as well. But how about another one of those digital welcomes to Gonzalo Duarte here with us today?
I think you should be able to share, Gonzalo, but ping us if you can't.
I will in a moment or so. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, David, and Eugenia for setting this up, and Kim for the invitation. I'm listening with great intent because in the arc of my work and career engaged in local and global service and learning, I'm constantly in a period of action and reflection. And when Kim first invited me to be part of this panel, which I'm honored to be, the first thing I said was, my research is 5 years old. I mean, this is, I actually not sure it's entirely relevant, especially since my current work as a community manager at the Center for Social Innovation is very much involved in supporting small and medium enterprises through this particular period. And then when I went back to look at it, I realized I must have received really good advice because I wouldn't change a word from the research that I did 5 years ago. I think it's standing the test of time, and some of you who are in this call have been part of Global Exchange, and of course are leaders in your own right in your local and global service and learning initiatives. So I thank all the people and lands upon whom this work is based. Before I get into the nuts and bolts of just a thumbnail sketch of the 6 standards of practice that I outlined that I think are as relevant now as they were when I initially did the research, I just want to pick up on this notion of unbordered. And you know, that, as David said, that's worthy of its own investigation. As a person with a lot of apparent privilege, which has been exhibited through the work that I've been able to do globally by moving freely, assembling people and resources to leverage good in housing and water and education initiatives, in particular in Nicaragua. Part of my reflective process has been how easily I've been able to do that and lead others to do that. And I think the notion of us being able to move without borders is as interesting as it is to watch coronavirus move without borders and see the tremendous disruption, which can be for good or can be for bad. So I just say that as a sort of a teaser and a spontaneous reflection on the notion of where we need borders and where we need to reduce borders and barriers. Because the work that I did and want to share again today, and let me just see if I can get this right. And here we go. You should be looking at something that says what to look for in global service learning. Is that right?
Yep.
Good. What I took was actually a fairly ordered approach to narrowing lots of other people's research into 6 standards of practice that not only reflected good just international volunteering practices, but that just reflected good community engagement wherever we are. And those things had to, I mean, they're obvious, they're not astrophysics, but I think what I was able to do here was to summarize in a fairly succinct way a number of standards, for example, organizational alignment, and to raise questions around what good organizational alignment looks like and what to look for, what are its characteristics when it's going well, and what to avoid, and to also identify again succinctly why it's so important. And all of you, this is known to all of you. I don't think there's anything here that's particularly new to anybody in this call. What I think is interesting, perhaps for later discussion, is how these are impacted, of course, by the current global reality and COVID, and the change in how people move or don't move, and how things are funded or aren't funded, and what they look like through an anti-racist lens, which again knows no borders. So I again raise this easily for you in this format, looking at sustainable management as the second pillar of a solid standard of practice, looking at responsible marketing, looking at integrated implementation, protection of people and planet, and of course, realistic evaluation. And all of this was geared toward really creating better conversation around distinguishing not only the structure, the internal structure of organizations, but how benefits are distributed, and looking in particular at the outcomes of what I call mutual private benefit, which tended to be self-centered and somewhat expansive for privileged people and limited for people on the margins of whatever the context is, and juxtaposing that against reciprocal public benefit, which aimed for citizenship building and capacity building on both sides of the volunteer and host community's experience. So, I mean, this, as I said, is just a thumbnail sketch basically of a survey of the research that existed around standards of practice, and an effort to really be more precise with our language, frankly, which again could be its own topic. I work in the field of collaboration, and I'm always surprised or always wanting to differentiate collaboration from cooperation, from coordination. And these terms that we use locally and globally, I think are really important. And one of my calls to action will be to just back up and investigate those a little further. So thank you very much. Of course, I'll be happy to share this with anybody or the group at large. And I look forward to further conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gonzalo. And again, thank you to you as well for coming in under that 8-minute mark. Wow, there are going to be awards for today's speakers. That's, Kim, are you noting that? This is fantastic. I facilitated a lot of events over the years, and you know, how do you precision in language? Gonzalo, I'm with you. As I've tried, at least, and sometimes to the point of annoying others when you ask, well, hang on a minute, what do you mean by that? And can we talk a little bit about clarity, and that words point to meaning, right? And isn't that all about context and culture and so on? And so, and isn't intersectionality really all about being more precise in our language? Or certainly, you know, at the root of it from a community-driven perspective. So thank you so much. I love what you had to say, and for those principles, I don't know if you saw the note, but Bill Sparks uses your work every year in his class at Humber College. So nice little shout out, and I'm sure we'll be sharing that with our participants today. I also noted, you know, I'm an electrician by trade. I did 8,500 hours in an apprenticeship, and you said you got good advice somewhere along, you know, and this idea of mentorship, and isn't that a launching point for further discussion? And who do you listen to? Who are you reading? You know, who are your mentors that are both dead and alive? And I think that's a really beautiful and wonderful insight, Gonzalo. So thank you once again. And all this applause that you hear digitally in I'm assuming Canada is going to be for you. So thank you very much for joining us today and for stepping into the dialogue. Our next speaker, once again, I think one of the themes for me is what the questions is, what do people do in their spare time? It's fantastic. I just can't believe how engaged and how focused folks really are. And our next speaker, she's a civil society leader. She's I love the alliteration here. She's a communicator and a curator of powerful conversations, and I'm looking forward to all that comes next. Founder of Platform. She steps into not just capacity building, but civic leadership capacity, which I think is wonderful among Black, Indigenous, and racialized young women and gender diverse people. She's the communications manager at Women of Influence. She works and founder of Platform. Did I already say that? And I love the fact that we know about Arezou that she's a natural storyteller. And I think that's a wonderful thing as well. And I know we're not going to have enough time, but thank you, a pre-thank you to Arezou for joining us here today. She's into transformational leadership, and she advocates for intersectional gender justice and equity in her work. Would you please welcome Arezou Najibzada here with us today before we head to our first round of questions. Arezou, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your kind introduction. And honestly, I'm feeling kind of nervous following up on all of these other amazing speakers. It's really hard to build up on top of the amazing words that have already been shared. But again, I think we brought up intersectionality, and we talked about just behavior and holistic change and reciprocal benefits. between actors and communities, and that really just defines all of the work that I do, and why my work is not really necessarily based on an intersectional analysis of the work, but on an intersectional approach to, again, bringing that analysis into behaviors, into organizational change, and into how we really shape the experiences of marginalized people, specifically Black, Indigenous, and young racialized women, who are the demographics that I mainly work with. And really my whole career has been defined by this pursuit to embrace and transform the experiences of women and gender diverse people, especially those of us who do experience further marginalization, who do have more problems to worry about because of, again, systems of oppression that kind of intersect to inform our experiences. And I'm constantly analyzing these experiences to reveal root causes and reveal barriers through stories, because, again, I feel I am a strong believer in lived experience as all we need to, again, to demand action, to demand change, and to inspire change in behaviors. And I think one of the problems I always have when I work with other nonprofits, or when I work with other communities, is that through my work, I've come to the understanding that there is this collective obsession with optics and representation versus meaningful engagement that has really plagued, I think, the nonprofit sector and civil society, to the point that where, again, just representation has become an end to itself instead of a means to an end, which would be a just and an equitable society. And earlier this year, when Kamala Harris was announced as Joe Biden's VP, running mate, everyone was already celebrating that as a win, as if, just having a Black woman to fill in this like colonial, hierarchical, and patriarchal position would suddenly make us, suddenly like meet all the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there were a lot of activists and Black folks themselves who were really, they read well into that. That was supposed to be a response to everything that was going on. But again, there is so much more that needs to be done before we can call these small representations a win for our communities, because more often than not, we know that they don't necessarily translate into holistic action, into inspiring change, and that is really a problem. And again, that also shows up in some of the local charities and nonprofits that I work with here in Toronto on a more local level. I walk into events where the organizer comes up to me and it's like whispers in my ear. It's like, "Hey, Arzu, like, thank you so much for coming. I just want to like apologize. I know it's not going to be up to your standards." And what I really hear is that, "Oh, I know there's going to be some, racist or hierarchical or oppressive things happening in this space, and we apologize in advance and recognize that we haven't done more." Right? So, what does that really tell us when we walk into spaces and into events when there is a land acknowledgement, where there is talk about, they say Black Lives Matter and they think, "Oh, we're so woke," but at the same time, they realize that, again, the systems they've created, the events and the way they are set up do not necessarily meet a certain equitable and inclusive criteria. So when you talked about incremental change towards achieving those spaces, or creating those spaces where we can come in and be our full selves and to receive the supports that we need to thrive and to participate, I'm gonna have to kind of disagree with that, because some of the experiences that Black folks, Indigenous folks, and racialized people are experiencing, they're not, it's not incrementally, we're not discriminated against incrementally, we're discriminated against as a whole and in very extreme ways. So when we do have situations where Black people, Black women, are going to be shot at by the police in the safety of their homes, I would say that that demands some form of radical change and radical reform now, in order for us to even be able to start at the very basis of just safety, like just basic plain safety on which we can then build those other steps of achieving equity and equality in decision making and community participation. And again, I say the same thing when I do work in leadership development for young women through both platform and my day job at Women of Influence on a more global level. Again, with Platform, we did research around young women, specifically racialized women's participation in Canadian politics, and we found out that 80% of young women who face sexism and gender-based violence like rape in Canadian politics leave politics or increase their inclusion or increase their participation in high amounts, or that 50% of young women will leave their tech jobs because of sexism, because of systemic barriers by the time they're 35. So when we're looking at these huge numbers, these huge experiences that are plaguing industries and sectors on global and local levels, again, incremental change, we've been about that for maybe like 50, 40 years since the second wave of the feminist movement. Now is really not a time to get distracted by optics and gestures on behalf of institutions. Now is really a time for these organizations who are engaging young women or trying to be equitable and intersectional in their work to really, again, take responsibility for the fact that they are a part of a problem. And if I'm doing a land acknowledgement as a feminist organizer, as an intersectional organizer, without recognizing how, those calls for justice for everybody that are outlined in the final report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, how does that play into my daily life as a Canadian, as someone who is living on this land? And how does that play into in my life as an organizer, as an advocate, and how am I forcing the governments to really, just like pinching their ears all the time, where's the action plan? Where's the funding? Where's the investments? How, again, because that land acknowledgement without really just following through with this platform and with these calls for action that have literally been laid out for us by Indigenous people through sharing their traumas and then compiling that into a framework, then how am I really going to be able to bring that holistic change into my organization and into the broader spaces that I take part in? So it's really more about setting aside the optics, setting aside those symbolic representations and actions, and really focusing on the knowledge that is available in communities, the knowledge that continues to be shared with, through Black, Indigenous, and racialized organizations and organizers, and to really take action on it. Because again, none of this is new. We've known about this for so long. And so really, I think now is really the time for action and for taking responsibility for whether or not we do contribute to these spaces or not, and how can we change that. So that's really the crux of what I was hoping to achieve today and what I do in my work. And I'm really excited about continuing this conversation in within the space and beyond. So thank you.
Thanks, Arazu. Really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the affirmation, the challenges, your collective obsession with optics. What a great phrase. I mean, aren't we all at some point a little concerned about that? Every morning we get out of bed and put on our outfits, but it's just, there's so much more going on than meets the eye, and optics really not going to get us there. And I really appreciate your thread of action, of calls to action, of systemic change. Got to be, I think, I don't know if you would agree with this, got to be top down, got to be bottom up, and hopefully we're gonna meet somewhere in the middle. And I don't mean middle by normative.
Yeah.
I just mean balanced. I mean equitable. I mean
collaborative
and more aware, and all of the above. So I love your notion of this, root causes and barriers. And we really do have to peel back those layers. And again, how do we do that consistently and do it in our families and do it when we read the news? And does that actually push us to act, or to pick up the phone and complain, or to go to the next step? Amir Emirani in the film We Are Many ends with this idea that change has never been granted. And I think you touched on this. It's always been demanded, and right. And it's this coming together, and again, I think the representation of what we're trying to do here today is I hope the beginning of a community, collective, collaborative call to action. Thank you. All this applause again for all the speakers. Thank you so much for you, Arazu, and for what you bring to the table here today, and for Gonzalo and Ikem, and for Sarah. Thank you. Let's go into a little bit of a conversation, and I'm going to ask all the panelists to unmute, and please just step in. And I think Zoom can handle that. And we are going to have a couple of rounds of conversation before we head into a breakout session, which I believe is coming up at about 11:20. So we have about 12 or 14, 15 minutes to just have a conversation. So Arazu, let's just, you're on screen, you know, calls to action. Let's get slacktivism. Slacktivism, you know, it's kind of a phrase. It's a, you know, something that means some to some and not to others. How do you get beyond this idea when folks think, you know, I'm gonna post something and I'm gonna hashtag it, and I've stepped in, you know, in some way. You know, I don't want to downplay the importance of signing petitions. That's important. But how do we get folks and influencers and people to get beyond just hitting send or submit? And anyone step in, but Arazu, I'd love for you to talk about that.
I'm going to talk about, again, that whole idea of just posting something and just thinking that that's it. I've done my part. I think I take a lot of issue with the idea and maybe the phrasing of slacktivism, because again, I do want to make sure that we are staying away from kind of ableist definitions of what activism and taking action means, right? Again, and that may have to do with ability, and it does sometimes have to do with, again, your social position and your social location, what you can do, right? I think I always, when I talk to a lot of people about what it takes to get young women into politics and what it takes to get marginalized people into politics. And, you know, I'm saying that, you know, a racialized mother working 2 jobs to, you know, as the sole income of a household, working 2 jobs to meet the demands and the needs of her family, she's not going to be interested in civic engagement. So how are we increasing the minimum wage? How are we providing childcare? How are we providing housing? How are we providing food security to the extent where everybody is going to have that chance to, again, actually act on all of these values and all of these aspirations that we have? So I think when I talk about activism and what it takes for people to do whatever they can to contribute to conversations around activism and taking action, I really just want to encourage everyone to just be mindful of just what a huge privilege it is for us to be in a space where not only our careers are hopefully aligned with our values and how we choose to live our lives, but, you know, but that we also have extra time to volunteer and do all of these cool things outside of work. So that's on that. But I think with the whole idea of, you know, again, it's optics. And I think everyone can tell you that what Instagram has done for girls and women's confidence, what it's done for what it means to be an activist and take part in movements and in conversations, it has changed everything. And I think social media has really, you know, recognizing a problem is not necessarily the same as taking action on that problem. And that's what it's really kind of narrowed it down to. And again, I think for us, really thinking about how, again, activism and social consciousness raising, there are so many different levels and so many different actions connected to that, that, you know, we can't necessarily just forego. You know, if you just posted that black square on Instagram and thought that that was activism, I'm not going to deal with you, you don't have the capacity for this conversation, but to really actually be like, okay, so this person now recognizes that. How are we going to now use that as a point for conversation? How are we going to, again, transform that one action, whether it was optics based or not, whatever the intention behind that was, and really raise the bar for what it means to actually take part in anti-racist conversations, take part in anti-racist action, to investigate how that person or how you yourself are taking part in racism and in anti-Blackness. So I think, again, that as a conversation started, as a consciousness raising campaign, that might have had its benefits. But at the same time, as you said, that can't be all. And there's a whole other sphere of actions that we must participate in based on our abilities and our social location in order to be able to challenge those systems and structures.
Ikim, thank you, Arzu. Ikim, Sarah, Gonzalo. Ikim, are you smiling? I can't tell. The box is quite small. I think you're smiling. You want to step in?
Yes, please. I am. I hear you, Arzu. I completely agree. Especially around the symbolism that has become the lowest hanging fruit, I think, for many of us community today. I think one of the greatest. I am a social media junkie. I engage a lot in social media. I interact a lot with people on social media.
Yes.
Much sometimes to my detriment, but I have never yet won an argument on social media. But I think that is the point. I think that when slacktivism, the way it's being described, is I see it as a question of risk. I see it as a question of what are you willing to risk and what are you willing to put out there to actually move the needle on the conversation. So many of us, because of our social location, age, access, race, abilities, whatever privileges that we have or don't feel that we don't have, determine what we're willing to risk in any one conversation. And sometimes the risk is merely the risk of appearing uneducated on a topic, or taking up space where you shouldn't be, or the risk of not saying anything when everybody else in your circle is. Right? So those are some of the pressures I think that we're all navigating, some of us with greater success than others, in terms of how to deal with the phenomenon of, remote activism. I think and this is an ongoing debate I've been having with a friend and colleague of mine, is I don't think the population of our global society, that the percentage of the population that is engaged in these kinds of issues, I don't think that has changed over time.
No.
I think what has changed is the tools and the mechanisms by which people are able to voice their opinions. So the folks who have continued to take the risks to their personal liberty, everything, that percentage of population I don't think has moved in terms of a proportion of our overall population. The people that I'm hoping that we can continue to find ways to invite into the conversation are those who their role has typically been to be able to be on the sidelines and watch that activism develop into something that benefits all of us as a global society. And I think I'm willing to give that maybe your role is like the wall in a squash court. To sort of reflect back what you're hearing in society, ways that you can bounce those conversations into spaces where other people might not be able to access. I think that's a positive. But I think there's a complacency that can be built of, I clicked that button, I signed that petition, I liked that thing, and that's it. That's all I've got to do. But I think, to Arzu's point, I think the invitation is what else? Where else can you bring this conversation into your own personal spaces? And what risk can you take in the places where you occupy space to have a conversation as a cisgendered man? Like, how am I bringing conversations about communities that don't have the same kind of power and privilege that I have in my own spaces, right? I think there was, in my family meetings and family conversations here, I've started doing this thing where we engage in land acknowledgements for Christmas dinner, right? We're a family of Nigerian immigrants who live here. The first couple of times, it was kind of like, what is this dude doing? Like, what conversation are we having here? This is not a workplace. Why are we doing this? But I think that's now kind of become a pattern of interrogating the spaces where we don't typically have these conversations. And my hope is that someone in my personal circle and my family circle can take that practice, and it can lead to a conversation about our role in the conversation, the national dialogue around what reconciliation really means as a thing, as opposed to a public policy.
It's great, Kim. Thank you for that. I'm going to take the last 7 or 8 minutes here before we step into breakouts and go to another question, and anyone again step in here. But how, and it's connected to this notion of calls to action and stepping in and what is real activism mean, and how do we stay connected? How do we effectively speak truth to power? And it's something I've wondered about for years. So, how do you write that letter meaningfully and know that it's going to get to the right people? I mean, and I'm talking practical. Do we ask for it to be minuted in a board meeting? Do we actually knock on someone's door? How do we speak truth to power in a respectful way that's going to make contact with reality? It's a big question, again, for 7 or 8 minutes before breakouts, but I'd love to hear from Gonzalo or Sarah or any of you. Please step in on that one.
Well, off the top of my head, just reflecting on my own practice, I abide by a motto that the meeting before the meeting is sometimes more important than the meeting. And what I mean by that is I have found success really developing relationships. And I hesitate to use that word because, first of all, I'm warm and fuzzy isn't my moniker. And secondly, they're very limited relationships, so I don't mean to imply that they're deep, but I have made some effort in the last 4 years, in particular since the 2015 election in Canada and 16 election in the US, now that I'm based back in Toronto, to get to know my local councillor, to volunteer in a campaign, and to write to people, or occasionally once call, in order to voice a particular point of view. And I have found that it's harder for people to turn away from that when they already know who you are. And I'm pretty surgical with those interventions, but I have, my spouse is involved in some other advocacy work related to the current political situation in Nicaragua, which is very tumultuous, and watched with interest the difference between communicating with public officials who know you and public officials who don't know you. So that early, just getting to know the people in some decision-making positions early on before you need them to listen to you necessarily has been helpful.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts from your perspective on stepping into that conversation? Thanks, Gonzalo, for being more proactive than reactive in a sense. And I remember sitting with a local politician, and we were having a coffee locally, and he looked outside and he said, "You see that lamp over there? You see that curb? Yeah, that's my work." And the point being that, it is doable, that change can, I guess, happen. He was being very positive, but it was about stepping in. And so thank you for that reminder. And the meeting before the meeting is what wonderful notion. Sarah, can you sort of close off this session for us with a couple thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I think this might be a little controversial, but I think there's still a lot of distrust in the political system, especially for Indigenous peoples. So when you're wanting to directly interact with a politician, it's very easy to think like, oh yeah, you could just go and do that, especially as an Indigenous person, because there's a lot of fallout that can happen when you stand up to them. And I've been in a direct conversation with ministers before, and it takes a lot of emotional toll on me as an individual and on Indigenous people. And I think, like Arizu said, it's a very ableist way of thinking of how to create change. And I'm going to kind of connect this with the last question, because I think one thing that is really stood out for me was that ability and role position that are in both of these. Is there's, in Indigenous peoples like makeup, there's this idea of gifts, and every individual has a gift. For some, it might be conversations, and for others, it might be civil discussions. And for me, it is really kind of connecting these two peoples together and working together. And I think that's where it needs to come. For a lot of political people I know, once they get to those positions of power, they kind of lose connection to the people that got them there. And for me, a lot more work has to be put on them to come and meet us, meet Indigenous people, and not just when it's needed. So like with the moose moratorium in Quebec right now, it shouldn't be just now that they're coming. And it shouldn't be when Mi'kmaq people had their fishery crisis with the lobsters out in the east that they come. It should be every single day they're making a concerted effort to come and learn about Indigenous people, why we are the way we are, who we are today, and why we're that way today. Because it takes a little bit of the emotional toll that it does take to just go and have a conversation. Because for people who have that very like cisgendered positionality, whether that be like your gender or like your actual like presentation, there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes of like your head and your like mentality when you're in places like this, even of talking. Like right now I have about like 100 things going on behind, like in the back of my mind of like, what can I say without trying to make too much of a splash on people, of also trying to protect myself, right? And I think that just going up and talking to a political person, like it just does not work. And it takes too much out of people, and it has to do with divisions of like gifts and having a collective action to create this change. So yeah,
that's terrific. I love the notion of meeting us, Sarah. That's a beautiful thing, and we all have gifts, and it's hard to remember that. I think I know in my own life it's a huge challenge to know. And I have people around me and family and friends to hopefully, remind me of it. And I wonder if that's kind of what you're speaking about when you say this collective call to action and this idea of gifts. We know ourselves through others, right? In a way, and in a big way. And that's an important part of, I think, community. So thank you for that. And again, thank you everyone for participating in a little bit of a conversation amongst the panelists. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to have some kind of cocktail reception later that we can all hang out and continue this, but we are going to break out now, and I'm going to hand it back to Eugenia and others to take us into some breakouts. And just know, folks, that we are coming back at 11:40, so we've got about 20 minutes in panels, breakouts, and then I think we're going to come back and try to sort of wrap it up with further conversation and dialogue and see what comes out of those meetings. So Eugenia, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and everyone. Wow. Truly, what a way to get us going this midweek and really for the months ahead. And now we get a little bit of time intimately with one of the speakers in your breakout room. So really use this time to bring your questions forward, carry on conversations. Feel free to unmute yourself when you get into your breakout space. For panelists, if you have questions for people in the room, please feel free to bring that forward.
Thanks, Eugenia. I hope everyone had as rich of a conversation as we did. I have a limited amount of time, and what's kind of interesting is we had a limited amount of time, but we covered a lot of ground and then talked about time and about how, this idea that we got to step in now, and what does that actually mean? And we're all here today, and I think that's a really good thing. And before I hand it back to you, Eugenia, I hope we can have a group discussion. I mean, it's hard to do in 15 minutes, but we've got our panelists, our experts here with us, And what I would love to, so Naomi Klein asked the question, quote, do we even have a right to be hopeful? With political and ecological fires raging all around, is it irresponsible to imagine a future world radically better than our own? A world without prisons, of beautiful green public housing, of buried border walls, of healed ecosystems, a world where governments fear the people instead of the other way around, close quote. And so I'd love to end on this notion and think about that. Do we have a right to be hopeful? And what does that actually mean? Our breakout session, thanks to Genevieve, she ended with this notion of opportunity. So I'm just going to toss that out. Toss that out. It's a horrible phrase, but I'm gonna put the question out there to everyone. You know, how do we stay hopeful? You know, from an impact perspective, realizing the challenges. So many threads here today, so many things that we could follow up with, and I hope we do that. But before you wrap us up, Eugenia, I'm opening it up to the group and to the panelists to step into that question, or any other one for that matter. But I'm going to use that as a guiding point. So, and again, if I don't get a chance, thank you to all for stepping in and joining with us here today.
So if I can step into that briefly.
So Ikim, you know what's so funny?
Yeah.
I was gonna cut to you. If the silence was any longer, I was cutting to you. No joke. I had you in my head thinking I could see the smile, and he's our next speaker.
So I'm listening to this retake of a podcast on CBC about the buffalo and the extermination of or the attempted extermination of buffalo in North America. And as we asked that question, I don't find myself typically in complete opposition to Naomi Klein, but I would say no to that. I think we have no right to not be hopeful. I think if there are the people in this world who have experienced the worst of our inclinations as a species, if they can wake up every morning and still move forward with grace and hope for what their day can be like, I don't think we have the right to abdicate that responsibility as a collective. I think, however, what we don't have a right to be is naive about the difficulty and the fact that this is not going to be an overnight project. I am impatient to see change, especially in the things that I think we can change quickly. But I'm not ready to shortchange getting lasting and inclusive change as at the price of purchasing it quickly. That's why, to Arzu's point, I don't believe in symbolism as a solution. I believe in it if it is an indication of where we are headed, but it must be followed with practical and tangible solutions and actual change. So I completely, and unfortunately this is being recorded, I completely and utterly disagree with Naomi Klein.
And I also disagree with Naomi Klein, mainly because I think it's very bold of her to assume, and again, I want to recognize she is a white woman, to assume that we come to this, and at least I come to this space from a place of hope. And I would say for me and a lot of the other young women that I work with, we come into this space as because of desperation, right? Of this is our last resort for aiming, for demanding, for begging for some form of positive change that is going to save lives in our communities, that is going to fundamentally change whether or not we are actually able to have hopes and dreams, right? Because again, hopes and dreams for so many people who are just not even meeting their most basic like needs. What are hopes? What are dreams, right? We wake up and we don't know if I'm going to be able to pay rent, if I'm going to be able to stay in school to achieve that dream of becoming a doctor, of doing whatever. So I think if people's most basic needs, which are not being met in a lot of communities, are not being addressed, then we are not going to have the capacity for hope, and we are not going to have the capacity for dream and for demanding better. So again, I think there's a lot of conversations to be had around inaccessibility, around community, and around what each one of us comes into different spaces from different standpoints and from different perspectives. So I think what we really need to pay attention to is the ways in which again, communities are calling for help, right? Because again, a lot of times the demands and the work that we are doing, it doesn't really come from a place of, where it is not fun for me to go out in a room and like talk about my trauma of like sexism and gender-based violence. That is not a place of hope, or that is not a place of, positive thinking. But it is being done with the aim that at some point, again, young women who come into these civic spaces and who come into these spaces are able to, again, lead with their heart and with their dreams and with their hopes, instead of with the trauma and the baggage that we bring with ourselves in these communities. So I hope that answered your question, but I agree with Akem.
So I just want to toss it out that Naomi was sort of posing a rhetorical question, and I encourage everyone to read the essay and watch the 8-minute video that was presented as well. It's very good and it's thoughtful, and I'm not going to say anyone's going to agree with her at the end, but she touches on a lot of great stuff. But all points for sure well taken for sure.
I mean, it's just the fact that I feel like the word hope has been kind of weaponized or used to kind of soften some of the demands and aspirations that do come out of marginalized communities to make it palatable to white audiences. So I feel like, and I mean, we just did an interview with Sanai Dubé, who does a lot of work around Black health in Toronto. And I think the interviewer asked her if she's hopeful about the future of Black Torontonians. And again, she kind of had the same response of, I like having hope is very naive in this situation, mainly because, again, the way the word hope and kind of positive thinking has been weaponized against marginalized communities to, again, take away from immediate demands into some form of futuristic solution. I think that's where a lot of tension comes in. So it may just be the word.
And to Gonzalo's point about precision in language is essential. And isn't it just a trivial truth to say, are we on the same page when we're having this conversation? Do I mean what you mean by this? You know what I mean? And that's a big challenge in itself, but it just and I find that's the beauty of conversation and being able to build a relationship, hopefully, that if you disagree, that you're still friends and we are still moving forward together. And that can come from a donor perspective, but it also can come from just, in my experience, at least, being on the ground. Anyone else want to talk about, kind of what's next? And we have about five minutes to go.
Yeah, David, maybe I could just pipe in on anger and hope, because I like the combination. So the anger for me gives me energy, what's wrong? And then the hope gives me goals. So I'm able to take anger and hope and translate it into energy and goals. So it's it's the opposite of you're weaponizing in order to gain momentum, rather than, oh, it's all so good.
Well, I think coming out of our breakout session, this idea of opportunity and what does that actually mean, and how do we, again, just to come full circle to even the title of today's session, this idea of organizational, systemic, transformative change. And in our group, I think we agreed that it was grassroots, but how does that affect, the top down systemic issues that we all face? So anger at it, but optimistic that maybe we can step in and take the next step. And everyone's context is going to be a little different, right?
And it becomes strategic goals. Yeah, great.
I just wanted to jump in and say, from the title of this session, I was actually expecting a slightly different discussion, but what I just want to thank the panelists for raising these insights. I think it's making me realize, no, not everybody is on the same page, and having this panel allows us to get to a point where we can be on the same page. But we were talking about risk, and we were talking about power in our group. I'm not going to recap everything because I'm not sure I can really capture other people's words, but there is risk in terms of what's at stake for you when you engage in trying to change systemic discrimination, systemic issues that you encounter within the sector, within your organizations, within your life. There are different degrees of risk. But I would also say that we all have different degrees of power, and we can use that power to center people who have been doing the work, who have been thinking about how to do change. They've already come up with frameworks that we can look at and adopt. And I think I would challenge everyone in this space to really go seeking beyond your bubble, beyond where you might feel comfortable, to find those frameworks which are in a lot of ways already there, that you can then take and apply to your work to make it more equitable, just, and anti-racist, and yeah, and inclusive.
Thanks for that, Sarah.
Yeah, this was a great learning experience for me. It was very insightful, Sarah's presentation and the other from Arizo, if I'm pronouncing your name right. Just because I came from a different background and the way that I'm originally from the Middle East, and I was engaged in the civic education and anti-discrimination programs for students and for women in specific. Maybe we ran programs in 5 different countries. What I'm just trying to understand here is that I see that there's collective action, but not on collective goals. And as far as Arizo explained to me in the breakout sessions, that these differences are based on the different needs from within each group or within each marginalized group. But is there a collective action, like a collective plan and a certain goal that all these organizations are trying to achieve, like priorities? Do we have a certain action plan that the civic community is trying to achieve here?
So you're asking the bigger question, is there an actual action plan? And yes. Well, you know what, that is I think a seed that you have now officially planted. And I think that's a question to us all, and I hope to OCIC as well. And Kim, Eugenia, does anyone want to step in there just before we wrap up?
Well, I don't know that I have all the answers, but I would say that one of the pieces of work that we want to be more a part of as OCIC, and hopefully OCIC as the collective, not the office, is the Just Recovery platform. That it's a national agenda that so many organizations that are driving change, the climate networks in particular, have put together, and hundreds and hundreds of organizations have signed on to Just Recovery. There are 6 principles to it, so we can put that up as well and share that in the follow-up. And we're planning to frame quite a bit of our work this year, the collaborative work that we do, so the storytelling, through Just Recovery principles, to make that platform so that we can talk about that more and not just tell the stories. We want to have these kind of podcasts and tell stories to our broader publics, but it's the internal story. We need to dialogue with each other more, in my opinion, and not just rush to the communications about what we do so well. But this that we're doing now is work more substantively together as a group to understand each other better. And I just wondered about, I think, Zara's point, and sorry, I take notes the whole time because that's how I listen, so I'm always looking down while you're all speaking. But I think this tremendous possibility here for us to learn much more together if we commit to it substantively, if we show up and really dialogue and listen. And I see Isabel Hachette shaking her head. There are many people in our community, in the OCIC membership and beyond the membership, people in youth policy have, people in the gender equality have, the people that we collectively reach through all the different activities that you do that are deeply embedded in these conversations and maybe willing to walk alongside others that are entering the conversation. So I'll leave it there. I think we have a lot of work ahead. And personally, I think we have no choice but to work towards hope and to work towards something better than it is. As Ikem said, you know, for our children, for our organizations, for the youth we say we seek to support, that's our obligation. There is no other way, in my opinion. That's so I think I'll pass to Eugenia to add anything else and to also close us off with this session.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. Wow. I think that, you know, my mind at least was feeling like a mold of clay. And throughout the hour and a half that we've spent together, it was squished and squashed and stretched and, you know, made a lot of different shapes. And I love that. That's a true indication of the wealth of insights that we've gained through this conversation. And I just want to express deep gratitude to all of you, but especially to Arzu, to Sarah, to Ikem, Gonzalo, and David. We really appreciate you sharing with us today. It's incredibly important that we hear different perspectives, and so thank you for this. Please stay with us. We have an hour's break. So please go get your lunch, stretch, perhaps do half an hour of yoga, whatever you might do. In the meantime, and join us back at 12:55. We're going to be promptly starting at 1 p.m. Our next session on community engagement and ethics around us. We're going to be honing in on measuring impact and what we mean by ethics and community engagement with really great speakers as well. So we'll see you very soon.